God showed you something you've never seen before. And it's usually, at that point, it's not a big detail, it's not a giant detail, but usually it's a small enough detail where finally, after reading it all those times, that detail jumps out at you, and all of a sudden you see the passage the way you've never seen it before. That's what I love about studying the Bible. And so over the month of January, we were doing a series through this familiar story of Daniel and the lion's den. And we're looking at each of the different characters involved in the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And last week, we looked at Daniel the prophet. We were trying to answer the question of what does holy living look like? And remember, the answer to that question was that holy living looks like a heart that is surrendered to God above all else. And that was the life that Daniel the prophet lived, right? What was going on in his life. Well, today we're going to look at a different character. The title of our series is The Lions, the Government, and the Prophet. So today we're looking at the first part of the government section of this passage. I know you're excited. Oh man, we're looking at the government. But as we look at this today, we're trying to answer the question of why even bother living this way? But why even do it? Is it even worth it? And if you've been a Christian all, you've been trying to live the holy life, you probably will find yourself asking that question more times than not. Is it even worth it? We're going to look at the passage in Daniel today and try and answer that question. We're in Daniel 6, and again this week I'm going to read it to you, but understand I am not going to read all 28 verses involved in the story. So I'll read a verse, or verses, and then I'll fill in the gap for you, and then we'll pick up in the verses, okay? Alright, so chapter 6, starting at verse 1. Alright, verse 1. Darius decided to appoint 120 officials over the kingdom stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These officials would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and officials because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. Of course, when the king picks a favorite, people get upset. And so that's what's going to happen in verses 4 through 5. The other officials realize that Daniel's didn't plan to be put over all of them, so they get mad about it. And they come up with a scheme. And the scheme we read out in verse 6. So the administrators and officials went together to the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever." All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce the edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as the law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. So King Darius signed the written edict. So he signs in verse 9 and read in verse 10 that Daniel, despite this being signed, what does he do? He goes into his house in front of the window and prays 3 times a day to the God of Israel. So verse 11. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, as a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and it is irrevocable. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles has ignored you. And the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. And he set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Then these men went together to the king and said to him, you know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians, that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. So the king gave the order. And they brought Daniel, and they threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, who you continually serve, rescue you." Skipping down to 19. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, has he been able to rescue you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke with the king. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angels, shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me. For I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. Skipping down to 25. Then King Darius wrote to those of every nation and language who live on the whole earth, "May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion, people must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. For he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." It's the word of God, the people of God, and thanks be to God. So our key verse today is verse 26, which says, "People must tremble before the God of Daniel." If that means that is our focal point of the verse, that means the character that we're paying attention to today is the king, King Darius. And King Darius is going to help us answer the question of, is it even worth trying to live a holy life? Why even bother living a holy life? He's going to help us answer that question. And if you look at verses 1 through 3, you see that King Darius isn't a stupid guy. He's actually pretty smart. He has some wisdom about him as the king, because he's ruling this mighty empire of the Persians, and he recognizes as a leader that there is absolutely no way that I can control this empire by myself. I need somebody to help me. And as a wise leader, King Darius sets up these other leaders underneath him to help him oversee the empire. Yes, he is the king, but even kings can't do it by themselves. They need help. And not only does he have the wisdom to set up these other officials around him, but he also has the ability to see and discern the really strong leaders, the really good leaders. He was able to see Daniel and recognize Daniel as, man, there's something different about this guy. And remember, Daniel is a holdover from the last administration. And whenever in the ancient world a king's administration switched from one house to another, that is not a peaceful transition of power. There is usually a lot of violence involved. And that includes with the officials that rule around it and are close to the king. But Daniel is able to survive because of his integrity, because of the hand of God upon him. But Darius, as this new king coming into power, he's able to recognize the gift of leadership, the quality of a person that Daniel is, and enough to the point where King Darius, he says, is going to set Daniel up as basically his right-hand man. He is going to be over all the other officials, all the other administrators, because Daniel is such a man of trustworthiness and loyalty. And as a leader, it takes some insight to be able to see that and recognize leaders like that. You can't just give it to your best friend or someone you're related to. No, what you got to do is find the right person for the right role that's going to be dependable, reliable. And King Darius was able to do that. But of course, like I said, King Darius had this plan, he had this goal. He was going to take Daniel and he's going to pick Daniel to be his guy over all the other officials. to help him oversee his funds to make sure he doesn't get defrauded. But those other officials looked at Daniel and thought to themselves, man, who's this guy to be over us? That should be my role. That should be one of us in that spot. And so they come up with this scheme, right? They try and find some way to trap Daniel. They look through all of his closets of his life. They can't find any skeletons found in any of them. There's no dirty secrets that Daniel's hiding. Now, the only thing they could find was Daniel's faithfulness to God. So they go to King Darius with that in mind. In verse 6, it tells us that they gave him, may King Darius live forever. That's a claim of loyalty. They're saying, King, we are your friend. We as these officials, we are your buddies. We're here to help you. But notice what they say in verse 7. It says, all the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance. And we agree what that ordinance is, right? It says that, hey, for the next 3 days, you should just tell everybody that you're God. They are to pray and worship you for 30 days. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I would sign up for any religion where God is only God for 30 days. You know? It's like, hey, it's like one of those guarantees, right? And after 3 days, you don't like our product. You give it back, we'll give your money back. Guarantee. Okay? But I don't know if I would sign up for a religion that did that. But notice how they begin that comment about trying to introduce this ordinance to Darius, right? What do they say? They say, all of the other officials and us, we think this is a good idea. This is kind of like that phrase of, well, you know, some people are saying, have you ever heard that phrase? They're trying to help you influence your mind and what you're thinking. They'll say, well, you know, some people are saying, but they never tell you who some people are. And in my years of leadership, one thing I'm beginning to learn is that some people usually just means them. That's kind of what's happening here. They're coming to king, and they're pretty much bold-faced lying. Seriously, if they had run this idea past Daniel first, the relationship between Daniel and Darius, would Daniel have not said something to Darius about the craziness and the absurdity of it? No. Daniel would have spoken out. But it says Daniel doesn't even know about this plan. So these other officials, to try and get what they want, they just outright lie to the king. They look at King Darius and they say, hey, we're all on board with this idea of making you God for 30 days. Now, verse 8 tells us, therefore, your majesty established the edict and signed the document so that as the law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. And this is really how it worked in this kingdom. Once the king made a law, it was law. It could not be undone. And so they wanted to make sure that this law that they were wanting, that King Darius knew what it was, put a stamp of approval on it, knowing 100% that this law cannot be just, well, we didn't like it, so we undid it. No, once this law is made, it is made. It is there. Now, in our country, that's kind of different, right? Our government works differently. But not in this culture, not in this time period. Once the king spoke, and his law was signed into effect, there was no change. The trouble is, when these officials come to King Darius and they say, oh, king, live forever, and then they come to him as buddies, and then they offer him the idea of, hey, we'll make you God for 30 days. They play right into his ego, right into his pride. Darius probably thinks to himself, I am the king, I am the ruler over this mighty empire. I have nations that are under my submission. I have leaders under my submission. I am the Ram Poobah. I am the alpha male. I am on top of the world. And in his mind, it makes sense. I am king, right? I went against these other nations, and they claim their God would save them. But guess what? Here they are. They're under my rule. So if I can defeat them and defeat their gods, that must mean I'm a god myself. So why not worship me? They play right into King Darius' ego. And that made him vulnerable. He took the whole thing hook, line, and sinker. And I hate it when the fish is the hook. Skipping down to verse 11. It says, "Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they come back to the king." And we don't know how much time has passed between when this law was first signed into effect by Darius to this point, but I'm sure it didn't take long. And they find Daniel praying, they approach the king and say, they remind him, didn't you sign this even a while back that we're only supposed to worship you for the next 30 days? Didn't you just sign that law? Wasn't it an irrevocable law of the Persians and Medes? It's like, yeah, you bet it did. I signed that law. And then verse 13, this is when Darius realizes what's going on. The official replied to the king, "Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, king. And the edict you signed, he's not paying any attention to it either." And remember in that edict what it said, if you don't worship the king for 3 days, if you pray to anybody else, they're going to toss you into the lion's den. That's the rule. That's the law that you made. It's irrevocable. It can't be changed because you're the king of the Persians. And the rules of the king of the Persians cannot be altered. Verse 14, as soon as King heard this, he was very displeased. In that moment, King Darius realized that he had been played for a fool. Remember, he had in his mind, he was going to set Daniel up as his right-hand man over all the other officials, pretty much his kingdom. And he's doing that, why? Because he recognized Daniel's loyalty and trustworthiness. And in that moment, after he realized what was really happening, he realized he betrayed the man that he trusted the most. Because he was gullible, he bought into the lie and the falseness that the other officials were putting before him. He signs the edict, and in this moment he realizes they got against the wall, and he's just betrayed this man that showed him nothing but loyalty. It's one of those moments where King Darius is like, what have I done? And not only does he betray Daniel here, but Darius undermines his own authority in the process. Remember, who's the one that has picked Daniel to be his right-hand man? It wasn't the other officials. No, it was King Darius. He picked Daniel. And now in one slick move, these officials have caused him to betray Daniel and undermine his authority. In one instant. When you read this, it doesn't seem so easy to be the person in charge, does it? Uncle Ben from Spider-Man was right. With great power comes great responsibility. And it tells us Darius, he is so upset because he knows betrayed Daniel, and he has to make it right. He has to do something. And so he uses everything within the power of his ability as the king to try and undo this law. Now, if you're like me, you're reading this, you're thinking to yourself, well, you're the king, can't you just say, it's not happening? But you have to understand, this is a different culture than we live in. The idea of honor and shame in the East is way different than it is here. For Darius to break his own law, to break the tradition of the Persians, that would be, that in his mind, that would bring dishonor and shame not just upon him, but upon his entire family line, upon the entire nation of Persia. He couldn't do that. When he was the king, he was supposed to be a symbol of the nation's power and might, a symbol of that nation's wisdom and understanding. So for King Darius to go back and just completely break the law in order to save Daniel, he would have had to go against everything he ever believed. So, but Darius, give him credit as the king. He does what he can, and he goes to these other officials. He's trying to find some way, some loophole in the law that allows him to set Daniel free, because he knows this charge against Daniel is a travesty. He knows it's not right. It's unjust. But despite all of his best efforts, this irrevocable law that Darius has made has sealed Daniel's fate. Verse 15 tells us those officials come to Darius and say to him, King, this is a royal edict. There's nothing you can do. Your only option is to throw Daniel into the lion's den. That's it. That's the only avenue you have. And so Darius, I'm sure begrudgingly and torn as he's doing it, sick to his stomach, gives the order. He has Daniel tossed in. Now, I know it says lion's den here, and the word den in the original Hebrew means to dig. So the way a lion's den worked back in this time period was pretty much they dug a hole in the ground where you could drop the food in, right? And I think in one of the verses it talks about them having to move the stone out of the way. You want to put a stone over the hole, that way the lions don't escape and eat people that take care of them. It's really important. If you're taking care of lions and one starts eating you, you're doing it wrong. Right? Huh? Right. So if you're taking care of any big cat and it starts eating you, something went wrong. At the same time, too, in order to get the lions in there, you don't just run out in the middle of the wild, grab the lion, hug it, bring it to the hole, and just drop it in. It's not going to work that way. Usually, this hole is dug into like the side of a mountain or something like that, where you could something where you could push the lions in from the side, seal them in there, so that they don't go anywhere else. Now, one of the reasons why the Persians use lions, this is kind of off topic, I'll share with you anyway. One of the reasons that why the King Darius uses lions and the Persians use lions, because lions represent kingship. Right? There's an entire movie series called The Lion King, working on that symbolism of the lion being a king. And so that way when they took their prisoners and those that were sentenced to death and tossed them into the lion's den, they knew without a shadow of a doubt that the king had given the order and that they were being destroyed because the king said so. Because it was the king of beasts to remind you. It was a power play and a reminder. So adds the reasons why Darius is sick. But he tosses Daniel in there. But notice Darius has no other options. This is it. It was literally the law versus his love of Daniel. He doesn't stop loving Daniel. It's obvious from the text that Darius is heartbroken. He's distraught. He loves this man named Daniel. But he's stuck between the law and love. And the law tells him there is nothing you can do. And so in verse 16, the king has only one left. He's tried all the other avenues that humanly are possible, and to no avail. So in verse 16, as he throws Daniel in the den, this is what he says to him. He says, "May your God who you continually serve rescue you." This is a man for 30 days who just signed signed a law saying, worship me as God. And he's in this moment acknowledging that there is, Daniel keeps worshiping this one God, this one living God he keeps praying to. Maybe this God that Daniel keeps praying to, maybe, just maybe, there's a hope that he will step in and save you. I've tried everything else. I've done everything I can do. Somebody else beyond me, higher than me, has to step in and do something because I can't. If I were to bet you $5 about how many hours of sleep Darius got that night, it would equal the amount of money I got from bed. Which is 0. Nobody would pick that. You all know you didn't sleep. You've been in that spot where you know you've made a wrong decision, or the decision you made has hurt somebody and caused pain, and you lay in the bed, you try and sleep, but you just can't, because the only thing that was playing through your mind is the scene of the day that has happened. And you're analyzing every little detail, trying to figure out where you went wrong, how you can go back and fix it. But no matter how many times you analyze it, the only thing you can see is I messed up. And I can't fix it. I ain't got enough duct tape to do it. That was Darius. And so it's out that restless night, he wakes up. As soon as the sun begins to come up, he runs from wherever he was at to the lion's den. And you can almost sense the desperation in Darius' voice where he gets to the tomb and he's like, Darius, Daniel, servant of the living God, are you there? Are you still alive? Has your God saved you? And every second there was a pause. Every second there was silence and no response. Darius' mind played at the worst, that he's going to open this den up and he's going to just see pieces of Daniel. But glory be to God, that's not what happens. He says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God saved you? And without hesitation, without holding back, Daniel says, may my king live forever. My God has shut the mouth of the lions. One thing, I don't know if you noticed this about this story. But in the story of Daniel and the lion's den, this is the first time in the entire passage where Daniel speaks. These are the only recorded words of Daniel in this entire narrative. And it is, may the king live forever. My God has shut the mouths of the lions. And this is one of those times where words understate what's really going on. It says the king was overjoyed. I don't think there's a word in the English language that can describe what the king was feeling in its entirety in that moment. There was joy, there was relief, there was love, there was gladness, there was happiness. There were all these things. Because Daniel was still alive. So what does that all have to do with answering our question? What does that have to do with our key verse? Remember our key verse in verse 26 where Darius says, I issue a decree that people everywhere should tremble in fear of the God of Daniel. And notice what Darius goes on to write when he issues this decree. It says, for he is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. For he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. This moment, the king realized two things. First, the king realized how long his law was. He had signed an edict for 30 days that no other God could be worshipped but him. And that outlawed the living God. And he knew it was wrong because the servant of this living God had been nothing but loyal to him. He had been proven proven himself trustworthy to the point where Darius was going to put him as his right-hand man over all of his stuff, over all of his empire. When a king has that faith in you and has that trust in you, man, you know you're in a good spot. Because kings aren't like that. They don't trust people that way. Their nature, their role creates that paranoia. Fast forward to the gospel time when King Herod is on the throne. Remember how paranoid he is? He's so scared that the king of the Jews is going to come out of Bethlehem that he goes and has all the 2-year-old boys and others slaughtered. That King Herod was so scared about losing his power that he would have his own sons put to death because he's afraid they were going to overthrow him. That's paranoia. That's that role. Because that's how it plays out in human terms. Violence and wickedness. In that moment, when he realized that Daniel in that lion's den, he realized how wrong his wall was. And there was nothing he could do about it. But just like he came to understand that how wrong his law really was, King Darius had nothing else to depend upon. When he had no other hope left, he only had one. And that was to cry out to the God of Daniel. That God that Daniel kept praying to despite this stupid edict that he had passed. Just maybe, if the king threw this one hope out there, left the door with this one possibility that maybe, just maybe, this living God Daniel prays to could do something. And with that small mustard seed of faith, what did God do? This was a man who thought he was God. And yet, when he's most desperate, when he calls out to the one living God, what does God do? God moves in an amazing and incredible way. He shuts the mouth of the lions, and if that wasn't enough to prove that it wasn't just a coincidence, when they take the officials and drop them in there too, the same lions that would eat Daniel instantly devour the families that are dropped in. There was no denying that this was God. This was power beyond what the king had ever experienced. That this wasn't a God who was off in some distant land. This wasn't some God that was bound to a statue or a temple. But this was the one true living God. And he was where his people were. In that moment, Darius learned why Daniel was so faithful. Why Daniel was so concerned with living a holy life. And why Daniel was so concerned about getting close to this living God. Because of Daniel, Darius acknowledges the one true living God. Through Daniel, God speaks to Darius. How does this apply to my life? Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. These are the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Doesn't give us much room, does it? We know by studying God's word that God has a standard. He doesn't lower it because you can't reach it. He doesn't make it higher so you can't. So it's impossible. No, God's standard is a standard. He says, be perfect. And Jesus says, be perfect as your heavenly Father. When it's talking about perfection, understand it's talking about that according to God's law, and God's law is what boils down to two. Love God and love others. That's it. It's that simple. Love God, love others. When I say love God, this is the kind of love that drives out all fear. That yes, you might be afraid, but your love is stronger than what the fear is. To me, whenever I think about that term, I just think of the beaches of Normandy in World War II. That's love. But it's scared? When Jesus was about to go to the cross and he was in the garden, hours, minutes away from being arrested, was Jesus scared? You tell me he's sweating drops of blood. Did that stop him? And he tells us as his followers, and again, it further cements this idea of be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, be perfect as God is perfect. He tells us, if you want to be my followers, you must take up your cross and follow me. When Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, that's telling us, you and I as believers in Jesus, that the path that we're about to embark on is not going to be easy. You're going to be living for God in a world that rejects God and rejects the ways of God. And the more you try to live for Him, the more you're going to encounter that resistance. And when you encounter that resistance, the world is going to pummel you. And just when you think you can't get any lower, Satan's going to come along and start kicking you while you're down. You see, the mistake we think about Satan is we think he's equal and as powerful as God is, that he's everywhere at once, and he's none of those things. He is a created being just like you. Except for he's an angel. So that's much more from my time. Sin rules in our hearts as human beings. Satan doesn't have to make a sin. Sin already starts here. He doesn't have to make a sin. We choose to do it on our own. No, so what Satan does is he attacks those who are trying to live for God. Because he knows that is going to make a change in their life, and that's going to change the world around them. He's not stupid. He's clever. So what he's going to do is those who try and live for God, the moment he senses that you're weak and you're vulnerable, that's where he's coming. And he's vicious. He will find that one weak point in your life, that one weak part of your mind and heart, and that's where he's going to press. When you take up your cross and live for Jesus, it's not going to be easy. Galatians 6:9. What does it tell us? You see, we know Jesus' commandment to us to go make disciples of all nations. Right? He tells us as we're living this life and living this holy life, we're to go out and invite other people to Him. We are to tell them about the good news. We sing a song about it at Christmas called Go Tell It on the Mountain. Right? That's what we're all supposed to do. But let's face it. If you've ever invited anybody to church before, you know how frustrating it is. You invite them to church and they'll say, yeah, I'll be there on Sunday. I'll see you Sunday. Save me a spot. And you save them a spot, you show up and you wait anxiously out by the door, you're watching, and service starts and you're 5 minutes in, like, well, maybe they're just becoming good Nazarenes early. Because Nazarenes are always late. 10 minutes in, that's when it begins to dawn, maybe they're not coming. But you think yourself, maybe it was just this one time, you invite them again, and time again, you keep working on it, you keep doing good things, you start doing good things to show them that Jesus is different than what they could ever think. And despite all you're doing, all the hard work that you're pouring into it, nothing's happening. And sometimes it just gets worse. You ever been there? That hurts. Always look like God sitting as a person in the first, so I got used to rejection that way. But the problem when you get used to rejection is you become numb to it. And you begin to walk around with the mindset thinking, I know I invited him, but I'll give you a nickel to show up. Is that the kind of mindset we should have as believers? No. That's where we get. And we begin to think to ourselves, maybe this whole living for Jesus thing, maybe I've got it wrong, maybe it's not worth it. I keep living for Jesus, I keep telling people about Him, and doing all these things, and all I'm getting is a bloody nose and a black eye and a broken heart. Why do I even bother? I'm sure Daniel was thinking that as King Darius, the man he was loyal to and trustworthy to. I'm sure he's thinking as Darius is thinking how we wind up here. I didn't sign up for this. This was not in the scripture. It didn't say, follow me, and we're going to end up in the lion's den. That's often what happens. But Paul writes this in Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. If anybody knows about how hard it is to live the Christian life, it's the Apostle Paul. If you read through the book of Acts, he will list off to you all the bad things that happened to him as he's ministering for Jesus. He casts a demon out there. What happens? He gets thrown in prison. He preaches Jesus. What happens? He gets thrown in prison. He preaches Jesus. What happens? They try to stone him. He preaches Jesus. What happens? They hit him 39 times with a stick because they know if they hit him 40 times, he will die. So they hit him 39 times. And they do that to him twice. There's one story in Acts where the other believers, they got him off, they think he's dead. And they walk off, and lo and behold, like a few hours later, the next day or so, Paul walks into the room. We thought she was dead. Paul's probably thinking, I did too. But here I am. Time and again. That's what happens. You read the book of Acts, it happens to all the apostles. If you really want to dig into it, read how all the apostles died, except for maybe one. And even that one that doesn't die, he gets left alone on an island to die, set free, and then at some point he gets boiled in a bucket of tar while he's living, and he survives that. But Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, verse 9, he says, do not give up. It's on the front of your bulletin. Somebody read it to you. What does it say on the front of your bulletin? Right. What John read was, do not grow weary of doing good, for in due season, in the proper time, you will reap if you do not give up. Then he said louder, if you keep on going, if you do not give up, good things will happen because of it. When Daniel's sitting all that night in the lion's den, waiting for any second for those lions to wake up from their nap and devour him, I'm sure he's thinking, I don't know what good's going to come from this, God, but here we are. And then the next morning comes, and not only does Daniel get free from the lion, but in that moment, this king who signed it, saying, I am God, says, your God did this. And then he makes another, well, he can't go back and revoke that bad law, he makes another one that trumps it. Because you can't argue over what Daniel's God did. The king knew it. Because David stayed faithful to God, he's continuing in his holy life. God was able to speak into the life of Darius. I'm here to tell you this morning, if you press on, you keep going, God will use your life too. So why bother with the holy life? Because your life of faithfulness is making a difference. You may not realize it, you may not know it, you may not realize who's watching you or paying attention to what you're doing and saying, but rest assured, my friend, the life that you're living for Jesus, all the times that you're inviting them, and all the times that you're doing good things, and it seems like they get worse, they make a mistake. That is making a difference in somebody's life, the kingdom. Your life of faithfulness is making a difference. So don't give up. Dear God, I come to you this morning. God, there's been so many times where I just wanted to say forgive me. There's been so many sleepless nights. So many days where I'm so stressed that I can't eat, I can't focus on anything I'm supposed to be doing. It seems like the more I try to live for you, the more the enemy finds my anxieties and attacks those. And most often, the moments where I just don't have any strength to stand up and fight back. Lord, we try to reach people for you. We try to proclaim your good news of the kingdom. We take names, we put them in this coffee can, and we pray for them. In some ways, God, it seems like there's just nothing happening. In other ways, God, it seems like your Spirit is leading us to nowhere. But God, we know that that is not true. Your Spirit is always moving us and directing us closer to you. Even when our eyes can't see and our ears can't hear, God, you're working in us and through us. All the prayers we send out, all the invitations, all the times we just sit and listen, all the time we go and pick that person up one more time and we drive them to where they need to go. All the times we fill up their car with food. God, even though it doesn't seem like that, we know it makes a difference. Because it matters. And God, in those moments where I feel defeated and broken, where I feel like Daniel in the lion's den, may I not forget your goodness. May you give me your Spirit so I don't give up. But that I keep on striving for the reward of your presence. But I can sense God here this morning. He is here.